Okay, let's take a deep dive into a world that feels both familiar and utterly alien. North America between 1500 and 1700. Forget the United States or Canada as you know them today. This was, well, a dynamic, often brutal patchwork.
You had Spanish, Dutch, French, English ambitions all clashing.
Right, not just with each other, but with powerful Native American nations fiercely defending their lands.
Yeah.
It wasn't an empty continent by any means.
Not at all. It was a period of intense transformation. European powers arrived with, grand plans, bringing new technology, devastating diseases, and radically different ideas about everything, really, land, labor, society.
But they weren't just imposing their will, were they? They had to deal with what was already here.
Yeah.
Existing native power structures, complex environments.
Precisely. They weren't operating in a vacuum. That interaction is key.
Exactly. We've got a stack of sources here, historical accounts, analyses, research that help us unpack this incredibly formative era.
Yeah, lots to dig into.
Our mission today is to quickly but thoroughly understand how these different European powers tried to establish control, the wildly diverse societies they created, and their incredibly complex, often violent interactions with Native Americans, and also with the Africans they forcibly brought over.
And in doing that, hopefully we'll uncover those surprising facts and, those aha moments, the things that show us just how much these early encounters shaped the landscape, the people, and, well, the very foundations of the societies that came later.
Okay, so where do we start? Spain seems like the obvious place. They were the dominant force early on, right? Their vision was massive.
Yeah.
Empire building?
Absolutely. Spain came in with really two main drivers. They dreamt of riches, gold, silver. That was huge.
The classic motivation.
But they also saw themselves as agents of God. Converting native populations to Catholicism was central to their project. Their whole model was very centralized, very hierarchical, designed for extraction, control from the top down, Spaniards at the apex, naturally.
And you see that reflected in the systems they imposed, like the encomienda.
Right. The encomienda. The crown basically granted Spanish settlers authority over native communities. They could demand labor, tribute.
Supposedly in exchange for protection and religious instruction?
That was the official line. But the reality, often just brutal exploitation. Later, they shifted slightly to the repartimiento,
Which is
still demanding labor, but it required native towns to supply a set number of workers for public projects or mines, usually on a rotating basis.
Yeah.
Still forced labor, just structured a bit differently.
So still focused on extraction. And their settlements reflected this, like St. Augustine?
St. Augustine, Florida, yeah. Founded 1565. It's actually the oldest continuous European settlement in what's now the U.S.
And its founding story is pretty revealing, isn't it? Menendez establishing it after wiping out a nearby French settlement.
Fort Caroline, yes. It wasn't just about territory, it was a direct export of European religious and political rivalry.
Catholics versus Protestants.
Exactly. The French settlers were Huguenots, Protestants, a threat to Catholic Spain, both religiously and practically. Spain worried they'd harbor privateers, pirates attacking their treasure fleets coming up from the Caribbean.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
But for the local Timucua people, the impact was just catastrophic. Driven from their lands, their population, maybe 200,000 before contact.
Wow.
By 1590, maybe 50,000. By 1700, barely 1,000 left, mostly due to diseases like smallpox, things they had absolutely no immunity to.
It's staggering. Disease is this invisible weapon. And St. Augustine was so important strategically, they built that huge stone fort later, the Castillo de San Marcos.
Right, to protect those shipping lanes. And their efforts push inland, too. You get Santa Fe, New Mexico, established 1610.
Were they still looking for gold there?
They hoped for wealth, yeah, but found very little mineral wealth in that region. So Santa Fe became the capital, set amongst these long-established Pueblo villages. And there, the main Spanish presence became the Franciscan missionaries, really focused on spiritual conquest.
And how did the Pueblo respond to that?
Well, initially, there was some adaptability. The Pueblo people incorporated some aspects of Catholicism that kind of resonated with their own worldview, syncretism,
Right.
But the Spanish priests pushed hard. They demanded the Pueblos completely abandon their traditional ways, their ceremonies, their kachina dances. And what really caused deep offense was targeting the youth, trying to separate them from their culture, their families.
It sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It was. Add to that harsh demands for tribute, forced labor, and then a long drought in the 1670s. The Pueblo increasingly saw this hardship as linked to the Spanish presence, these disruptive outsiders, plus raids by neighboring Apache and Navajo groups seemed to increase.
And they blame the Spanish for that, too.
Sometimes, yeah. or saw as a sign the balance was wrong. And this is where a Pueblo leader named Pope comes in.
Right, Pope.
He galvanized resistance. He called for a return to the old ways, arguing very powerfully. When Jesus came, the Corn Mothers went away. Expel the Spanish, he urged, and balance prosperity, the favor of the spirits would return.
And it worked.
Amazingly, yes. In 1680, dozens of usually independent Pueblo villages coordinated a massive revolt. They killed over 400 Spaniards, many of them priests, and drove the remaining 2,000 settlers completely out of New Mexico.
Completely out. For how long?
For 12 years. It's arguably the most successful instance of native resistance against a European power in North American history.
12 years. That's incredible. And the Spanish reaction when they finally returned in 1692.
Well, their interpretation was telling. They tended to see the Pueblo's success not just as a military or political defeat, but as the work of the devil, a spiritual battle.
So what's the big takeaway from the Spanish experience here?
I think what the sources show is this fascinating clash. Spain had this rigid, top-down, extractive, conversion-focused model, huge ambition, military might, but it often failed to account for the reality on the ground, the strength, the agency of native peoples, the sheer vastness of the continent. Their grand vision often just couldn't cope with determined resistance or the practicalities of control.
Okay, so let's shift north. The rivals, the Dutch and the French. Their colonial efforts looked quite different.
Very different, much more modest, really, focused much more on trade, especially furs, rather than mass settlement or large-scale agriculture like the Spanish were attempting further south.
So the Dutch in Netherlands, that's present-day New York.
Right. Primarily a fur trading post, controlled by the Dutch West India Company. They just didn't attract that many settlers, only about 9,000 by 1664 when the English took over.
Why so few?
The company maybe wasn't promoting it as heavily, and the Netherlands itself was relatively prosperous, maybe less pressure to emigrate, but that small population created issues. Labor shortages, for one.
How do they deal with that?
Well, it forced them to adapt. They certainly had conflict with natives, but they also relied on them heavily for the fur trade. And to deal with labor needs, they imported enslaved Africans quite early on.
Ah, right. And wasn't there something about Wall Street?
Yes, that's a fascinating detail.
Yeah.
Enslaved Africans were actually tasked with building a defensive wall on the northern edge of New Amsterdam to protect against potential attacks. That wall's location, that's present-day Wall Street.
Wow, that really brings it home. And this small colony was surprisingly diverse.
Extremely diverse for the time. Needing people, they welcomed non-Dutch immigrants, various Protestant groups, even Jews escaping persecution elsewhere. One visitor famously claimed to hear 18 different languages spoken in New Amsterdam. Quite cosmopolitan.
And they had that patroonship system, too.
Yeah, the patroonships. Huge land grants given to wealthy investors if they brought over at least 50 settlers. It was meant to encourage settlement, but ended up creating these vast estates and a pretty significant wealth gap. Almost feudal in a way.
Okay. And their native interactions were all about the fur trade.
Pretty much. European goods, kettles, tools, guns, alcohol flowed into native communities through established trade routes. Posts like Beverwyck, which is now Albany, were key exchange points. Furs for goods.
And crucially, they armed the Iroquois.
Yes, they provided muskets to the Iroquois Confederacy. This had huge consequences.
Because the Iroquois were already in conflict with others.
Exactly. They were rivals with the Algonquian-speaking peoples to their north and west, groups who tended to be allied with the French. Giving the Iroquois firearms dramatically escalated these existing conflicts, leading to the Beaver Wars. It reshaped the whole native political map in the Northeast and Great Lakes.
Okay, so let's talk about the French then. New France, Canada, also focused on fur.
Overwhelmingly, Quebec was essentially a fur trading outpost, but even fewer French settlers came than Dutch. Many back in France saw Canada as this inhospitable frozen wasteland. Fewer than 400 settlers by 1640.
So tiny. How did they even survive?
Heavy reliance on local Native Americans, especially Algonquian groups like the Montagnais and the Huron Confederacy. They needed them for survival, for food, for a knowledge of the land, and absolutely for accessing the fur trade networks.
And like the Dutch, they provided firearms.
Yes, but they armed their allies, the Algonquian and Huron, primarily to help them in their ongoing wars against the Iroquois, who, remember, were getting guns from the Dutch. So you see this European rivalry fueling native conflicts through the arms trade.
What about conversion efforts? The Spanish were intense about it. The French?
They had conversion efforts, yes, mainly through Jesuit priests. The Jesuits were an elite Catholic order, highly educated, and while their numbers in New France were small, they were influential.
And they left records, right? The Jesuit relations.
Incredible records. Their annual reports, the Jesuit relations, give us really detailed, though obviously biased, accounts of their interactions with native peoples, their cultures, their beliefs. It's a unique window.
Any specific stories stand out? Kateri Tekakwitha.
Yes, Kateri Tekakwitha is a famous example, a Mohawk woman who converted to Catholicism and became known for her piety. The Jesuits wrote extensively about her, though it's interesting the church itself hesitated for a long time to canonize her, partly because of prejudice against, as they put it, a savage.
And the relations also give insight into native life itself, like healing practices.
Absolutely. There's a fascinating passage from Jean de Brebeuf in 1636. He describes a native illness called okerohi. The natives believed it stemmed from some kind of spiritual imbalance or perhaps sorcery.
Okay.
And Brebeuf notes with some astonishment that among the remedies prescribed by native healers were games. Specifically, he mentions lacrosse, or crosse, as he called it, and another game involving dishes.
A game as medicine. Why would they do that?
It seems baffling from a purely European medical perspective, right? But Brebeuf writes, "There is a poor sick man, fevered of body and almost dying, and a miserable sorcerer will order for him a game of crosse." What stands out is the different worldview. For many native cultures, health wasn't just physical. It involved social and spiritual balance. A communal game like lacrosse, which was physically demanding but also socially important, might have been seen as a way to restore that balance, engage the community in healing, maybe symbolically purge the illness.
Yeah, that's a fundamentally different way of thinking about health and community.
Exactly, and it highlights the cultural chasm the Jesuits were trying to bridge, or rather impose their own views across.
So if you look at the Dutch and French together, what's the key insight?
I think what's fascinating is how their relative weakness, their small numbers, their focus on commerce, forced them to engage with native power structures and trade networks more pragmatically than the Spanish initially did. They needed native partners.
Did that lead to better relationships or just different exploitation?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? It certainly led to different kinds of relationships, more interdependence, perhaps more cultural exchange in some areas, like with the Jesuits living among native groups. But it didn't stop them from pursuing their own economic interests, like fueling the arms race in the Beaver Wars, which had devastating consequences for native peoples. It was often a coexistence born of necessity, not necessarily mutual respect.
Okay, let's turn to the English. They arrived a bit later, but seemed to catch up fast in terms of numbers.
Yes, the English model was different again. They actively encouraged emigration much more than the French or Dutch and ended up bringing far more people over. But they didn't just have one model. They developed two quite distinct colonial societies.
You mean the Chesapeake versus New England?
Exactly. Virginia and Maryland in the Chesapeake, and then the Puritan colonies like Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay up north, worlds apart in many ways.
Let's start with the Chesapeake. Virginia, Maryland. What was driving them?
Primarily commerce, making money. The Virginia Company founded Jamestown in 1607, hoping for gold like the Spanish.
Did they find any?
Nope, no gold. But they quickly discovered tobacco. And tobacco became incredibly profitable in Europe. Maryland, founded a bit later by the Calvert family as a refuge for English Catholics, also jumped onto the tobacco bandwagon pretty quickly to survive economically.
But those early years were brutal, right? Jamestown's starving time.
Horrific. That winter of 1609-1610, we have accounts, like George Percy's. It's grim reading. People eating anything they could find. Dogs, cats, rats, mice, leather. He even mentions resorting to cannibalism, digging up corpses.
Unimaginable hardship.
It really underscores how precarious these ventures were. But Jamestown survived. They found political stability eventually, with the House of Burgesses in 1619, the first representative assembly, and economic stability with tobacco.
But tobacco needed workers.
Yeah.
Lots of workers.
Immense amounts of labor. It's incredibly labor-intensive. Initially, they relied heavily on indentured servants.
Explain that system again.
Sure. Mostly young, poor English men and women would sign a contract, an indenture, usually for 5 to 7 years. In return, they got their passage paid to America, food, shelter, and then freedom dues at the end, maybe some tools, clothes, sometimes a promise of land, though that often didn't materialize.
Sounds like a tough deal.
It was incredibly harsh.
Yeah.
Servants had few rights, contracts could be sold, terms extended for minor infractions. Women were especially vulnerable. But the potential reward, land ownership through the head rights system, getting 50 acres for paying your own way or bringing someone else over, that was the big draw, especially for the planters importing servants.
Okay, but then things shifted towards slavery.
Yes, and this is a really crucial development. Africans first arrived in Virginia in 1619. Initially, their status wasn't always clearly defined. Some seem to have been treated like indentured servants capable of eventually gaining freedom.
That changed.
Dramatically. By the late 17th century, both Virginia and Maryland were solidifying a system of chattel slavery. Enslaved people defined legally as property for life, and crucially, their status was inherited by their children, based on race. It's also important to note that Chesapeake colonists also enslaved Native Americans, especially captives taken during wars.
What caused that shift? Was there a specific trigger?
Many historians point to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 as a major catalyst.
Tell us about that. Bacon versus the governor.
Right. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy planter, but kind of an outsider, excluded from Governor Berkeley's inner circle. He tapped into widespread resentment among colonists, especially former indentured servants who wanted land further west on Native American territory.
And Berkeley was trying to stop them.
Berkeley was cautious. He feared sparking a wider war with the native tribes and tried to enforce treaties restricting westward expansion. Bacon and his followers felt Berkeley wasn't protecting them from native attacks and was hoarding opportunities. Bacon attacked the Susquehannock without authorization. Berkeley ordered his arrest.
And it blew up.
Into a full-blown civil war within the colony. Bacon's forces, a mix of white frontiersmen, former servants, and even some enslaved Africans and free blacks, marched on Jamestown and burned it.
Wait, black and white fighting together against the establishment?
Yes, and that is what really terrified the wealthy planter elite, the potential for cross-racial, lower-class solidarity against their rule.
So the shift to slavery was partly about control.
Exactly. Racial slavery offered a way to solve multiple problems for the elite. It reduced their reliance on potentially rebellious white indentured servants who demanded land and rights once freed. It created a permanent, controllable labor force defined by race, making solidarity across racial lines much harder. And critically, it helped create a sense of shared white identity, uniting poor and wealthy white people against a common racial other, thus muting class tensions.
So after Bacon's rebellion, they passed laws to cement this.
Precisely. Following the rebellion's suppression by royal troops, Virginia passed a series of laws after 1680 that explicitly stripped rights from black people, enslaved or free, banning firearms, forbidding large gatherings, making any child born to an enslaved mother enslaved for life, partus sequitur ventrum, regardless of the father's status, codifying racial slavery into law.
And we have accounts reflecting this.
Yeah.
Like Robert Beverly.
Yes, Robert Beverly, writing in 1705, clearly distinguishes between servants for a time, the indentured servants, and slaves for life, whom he identifies specifically as Negroes and their posterity following the condition of the mother.
He talks about their work too, doesn't he?
He does. He notes that while male servants and slaves both worked the fields, white women's servants were rarely or never put to work in the ground because laws taxed planters heavily for doing so. But, he says, it was a common thing for enslaved women to do field labor. It starkly shows the legal difference enslaved people, particularly women, lacked even the minimal protections afforded to white servants. The system was being built right there in the law.
And the Chesapeake colonists' relationship with Native Americans.
Pretty much constant conflict from the beginning. They settled right in the middle of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. English encroachment, their demands for food, their refusal to follow native protocols like gift-giving, it all created friction.
The Anglo-Powhatan Wars.
Exactly. Fought on and off for decades. Even the famous Pocahontas marrying John Rolfe only brought a temporary truce. English expansion just kept pushing, leading to more war and eventually the near-total destruction of the Powhatan villages near Jamestown. It bred deep intolerance and hostility towards natives in that region. And, as mentioned, they enslaved captives, too.
Okay, so a very different picture up in New England. Puritan colonies.
Completely different motivation, primarily. These were largely families migrating together in the 1630s, often following their ministers. They weren't primarily seeking economic opportunity, but religious purity.
Puritans seeking to purify the Church of England.
Right. They aimed to create a model society, a city upon a hill, as John Winthrop famously called it, based on their interpretation of Reformed Protestantism. It wasn't about religious freedom for everyone, but freedom for them to practice their specific beliefs.
And their seal even showed a native asking for help.
Yes, the Massachusetts Bay Company seal depicts a Native American saying, "Come over and help us," reflecting their stated mission of converting Native peoples alongside building their own godly society.
And their society reflected these religious goals.
Deeply. Emphasis on literacy was huge because everyone needed to read the Bible. That led to things like the first printing press in the colonies, publishing things like the Bay Psalm book. Their Calvinist belief in predestination shaped everything: the intense focus on personal morality, community oversight, and the requirement for church members to publicly narrate a convincing conversion experience.
But not very tolerant of different views.
Not at all. They were building their perfect society, and dissent wasn't welcome. Roger Williams got banished for questioning their right to take native land without fair purchase and for advocating the separation of church and state. He founded Rhode Island as a refuge.
And Anne Hutchinson.
Anne Hutchinson challenged the authority of the ministers, claiming individuals could receive direct revelation from God. That was deeply threatening to the established order. She was interrogated, condemned, and banished. When she was later killed in an attack by natives, Governor Winthrop basically saw it as divine judgment.
And the Salem witch trials fit into this somehow.
Yes, Salem in 1692 is a chilling example. You have this intense belief in the supernatural, in the devil actively working in the world. Combine that with societal anxieties, recent wars with natives, political uncertainty, local disputes, and it exploded into accusations of witchcraft, mostly against women who didn't fit the mold. 19 people were executed. It's a dark chapter showing the extreme side of that worldview.
What about their labor system? Different from the Chesapeake's reliance on servants and slaves.
Very different. It was much more based on family labor. Children were expected to work diligently from a young age, contributing to the farm or household crafts. There were fewer indentured servants compared to the Chesapeake, and towns often tried to protect local workers. This perhaps contributed to New England developing a more diversified economy later, including a strong maritime sector, fishing, shipbuilding, trade.
And their interactions with Native Americans started peacefully with the Pilgrims and Wampanoag.
Initially, yes. Some local Algonquian groups, like the Wampanoag under Massasoit, saw the early English settlers at Plymouth as potential allies against their own rivals. That famous 1621 treaty and feast, the origin of the Thanksgiving story?
But that didn't last.
No. As more Puritans arrived and expanded inland, conflict became inevitable. The Puritans allied with other tribes, the Narragansett and Mohegan, against the powerful Pequot tribe. This led to the Pequot War and the absolutely brutal Mystic River Massacre in 1637, where an entire Pequot village was surrounded and burned with hundreds killed.
Then King Philip's War.
That was the breaking point, 1675, 1676. A massive uprising led by Metacom, Massasoit's son, whom the English called King Philip. It involved multiple tribes across New England reacting to continued English encroachment and pressure. It was incredibly bloody on both sides, and for a time it looked like the natives might actually drive the English out.
But the English ultimately won.
They did, at a terrible cost to both sides, especially the native population. And the war had a profound psychological impact on the English. It shattered any remaining notions of peaceful coexistence for many, and fostered a deep-seated racial hatred and vilification of Native Americans as inherently savage and treacherous. Captivity narratives like Mary Rowlandson's became bestsellers, shaping this negative image for generations. And again, many native captives were sold into slavery, often sent to the West Indies.
So looking at these two English models, Chesapeake and New England, the differences are stark.
Absolutely profound. Different reasons for coming, different social structures, different labor systems, different relationships with native peoples, one driven by commerce, becoming reliant on enslaved African labor, the other driven by religion, based on family labor, developing a different kind of intolerance. These laid the foundations for distinct regional cultures that persisted for centuries.
It really makes you wonder how much of the later North-South divide in the U.S., especially over slavery, has its roots right here in these fundamentally different colonial beginnings.
It's a very compelling question. The seeds were definitely sown early on.
Okay, let's broaden the view again. Looking across all these regions, Spanish, Dutch, French, English, what were the biggest transformations happening between 1500 and 1700?
Well, one overarching theme is the institution of slavery. We've touched on it, but the sheer scale is crucial. The absolutely crushing demand for labor, especially for cash crops like sugar in the Caribbean and tobacco in the Chesapeake, drove this massive forced migration of Africans.
The Atlantic slave trade really ramped up.
Hugely. The English Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, is just one example. It transported something like 350,000 Africans in just a few decades. By 1700, places like Barbados were majority enslaved African populations. The scale is hard to comprehend.
And we need to remember, this was a new kind of slavery.
Fundamentally different from many forms of bondage that existed in Africa or other parts of the world. This was chattel slavery, people treated as property, based explicitly on race, permanent, hereditary.
Dehumanizing.
The journey itself, the Middle Passage.
Unspeakably brutal. Packed into ships, horrific conditions, disease rampant, immense loss of life even before they reached the Americas. And then forced into brutal labor regimes, constant violence, the stripping away of culture and family ties.
Yet resistance happened.
Constantly, in myriad forms. From everyday acts like working slowly or breaking tools, to running away, sometimes forming independent maroon communities in remote areas, trying to rebuild lives on their own terms. Resistance was part of the system from the start.
Native life was also completely overturned, wasn't it? Irrevocably. You see it in material culture. European goods, glass beads, copper kettles, iron tools, textiles flooded native communities. Sometimes they replaced traditional items, sometimes adapted in creative ways, like cutting up kettles for jewelry. Iron awls made producing wampum beads much faster, increasing their importance in trade and diplomacy.
Then weapons.
European weapons changed everything. Metal tools became weapons, like axes and muskets. This fueled an arms race among native groups, made warfare much deadlier, shifted power balances. Groups that got guns first gained an advantage, and eventually, of course, those guns were turned against the colonists themselves.
The environment changed too.
Drastically. The demand for furs, especially beaver, led to overhunting that decimated beaver populations in many areas. That meant loss of beaver ponds, which altered waterways and ecosystems. Introduced European animals, especially pigs roaming freely, destroyed native food sources like shellfish beds and edible roots.
And just the fundamental idea of land ownership clashed.
A huge point of conflict. Europeans brought concepts of private property buying, selling, fencing off land. Most native cultures had concepts of communal use or usufruct rights to use certain areas for hunting, fishing, farming seasonally, but not individual ownership of the land itself. This led to constant misunderstandings, disputes, and the gradual confinement of native peoples as Europeans fenced off more and more land.
But underlying all of this, the biggest impact was disease.
Without a doubt, the single greatest factor in the transformation of the continent. Native peoples had no prior exposure, and therefore no immunity, to European diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza.
The death tolls were just unbelievable.
Catastrophic. We mentioned the Timucua. Along the New England coast, maybe 75% mortality between 1616 and 1618, even before the Pilgrims arrived in large numbers. Maybe half the Huron and Iroquois populations died in epidemics in the 1630s.
It wasn't just the numbers, was it? It was who died.
Losing elders meant losing invaluable knowledge, history, traditions, leadership. Losing children meant losing the future. It shattered societies. Some scholars suggest practices like mourning wars, capturing individuals from enemy groups to adopt and replace lost family members, intensified partly as a response to these devastating population losses from disease.
And finally, the Columbian exchange plans moving back and forth.
Right. A two-way street, though, with unequal consequences. Tobacco from the Americas conquered Europe, creating huge markets and fortunes. Sugarcane, brought from the Old World to the Americas, created brutal plantation systems built on slavery. European botanists were fascinated, cataloging new species like Sir Hans Sloane in Jamaica.
But there was also indigenous and African knowledge about these plants.
Crucial knowledge, often ignored or distrusted by Europeans. Medicinal uses, for instance. Sources mention enslaved women and native people knowing about plants like the peacock flower, which could be used to induce abortions, a hidden form of resistance in horrifying circumstances. That knowledge was often dismissed due to prejudice.
So if you pull all these threads together, disease, slavery, new goods, environmental shifts, clashing ideas about land.
What you see is not just a series of isolated changes. They're all interconnected. They created this dynamic, often incredibly violent, but fundamentally new world in the Americas. It was different from Europe, different from the pre-contact Americas. It was something new being forged in these encounters.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive today,
Yeah.
we've unpacked these really distinct approaches: Spanish, Dutch, French, English,
Yeah.
the different societies they tried to build, and the immense, often tragic, impact on Native Americans and the Africans brought here by force.
Yeah, early North America wasn't some empty stage. It was a crowded arena. Competing empires, powerful native nations resisting and adapting, the horrific rise of racial slavery, and just profound changes to ways of life and the land itself.
The sources really show how everything was shaped by this mix of, well, necessity, greed, ideology, opportunity, and almost constant conflict. So maybe the final thought to leave you with is this. Considering these diverse, challenging, often brutal beginnings, the clashing ideas about race, land, labor, religion, what enduring questions does this raise about the very foundations of the societies eventually built on this continent? And what does understanding this complex history and all its regional variations and continent-wide impacts mean for how we understand North America today?
Definitely something to think about. A lot to chew on there.